Okay, so I suppose we'll get started here. Thank you all for being here and braving lingering ice and shoveling and etc. And to those of you online, thank you for being here virtually to join us. I'm Diana Marsh. I'm an assistant professor in archives and digital creation here. And this year, co-director with Jess Grimmer of the Center for Archival Futures. CAFE was established in 2021 as an interdisciplinary group at the iSchool, looking kind of broadly at archives and digital curation and the use of archives and digital objects and data and their stewardship over time. We've got lots of different projects going, and we do a range of different experiential learning and talk series like these, as well as a number of research projects as a group. So check out our website if you want to learn more about that. This is the flagship event that we run, ordinarily held on the first Wednesday of each month during the semester. So this is the first for this spring. And we try to bring in speakers who are at the cutting edge of this field and that bring together the same kind of spirit of interdisciplinarity that we bring together at CAFE. So we have a whole number of upcoming events. We've almost got something every week coming up over the next month. So we've got Douglas Day coming up next week. I'm going to hand it to Victoria for a second to say something about that.
So we'll be meeting in the piano room in the Clarice Performing Arts Library from 12 to 3. Yep. To celebrate Black History, Joy, Love. With the internationally beamed Douglas Day celebrations from our colleagues at the at Penn State, at UPenn, definitely an institution in Pennsylvania. And we'll be transcribing and maybe doing a little bit of music and coding and eating and being in community with each other. All welcome.
Fantastic. On February 20th, Friday, February 20th, we are really excited to host Dr. Colleen Shogan, former archivist of the United States, here. We'll be having a pre-reception at 4 o'clock, and then the talk, just in-person talk, although we are hoping to be able to record it. And that'll be from 5 to 6:30, and that'll be a moderated discussion. And we're really excited to talk about sort of the future of archives and records here in the US and sort of at America 250 and sort of what records mean in the current environment. So that should be really fun. On February 27th, following Friday, we have a small exhibit opening at the Hornbeck Library next door. So this is a small exhibition curated by our students in museum studies over 2 fall semesters and with Jenny Schellert in the libraries. And we've got a small set of cases on the history of the College of Information in time for our 60th anniversary. So we're really excited about that. And then on March 4th, we have our second flagship speaker series with Amelia Acker to talk about her new book, which will be pretty cool. So I'll stop there, but tons and tons of events. So check out our cafe.ischool.umd.edu/events to see that and all of our previous events. And then before I turn it over to our full speaker introduction, I want to acknowledge that we're here in College Park, which is on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and the Kashtuk and their indigenous kin and neighbors. And to acknowledge that as a land-grant university, we benefit from 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land through the Morrill Act in 1862. We've got lots of really cool projects in reclamation around these issues. We'll post a little story map in the chat if you're there to see some of those documents and records that actually a former MLIS student compiled to look at that history. And I recommend to also look at the Maryland State Archives MIES project. They've done a really excellent job to build a digital database of Indigenous Maryland collections. And we also recommend to check out the Accokeek Foundation and possibly donate to them. They're doing tons of really cool programs around land use and sort of indigenous reclamation there. And then finally, we want to acknowledge the history of slavery and generations of racialized trauma in the institution. Sorry, I'm just And we want to acknowledge the 1856 project, which is a project that's undertaken here in our library and special collections that looks at the history of slavery through the history of the institution, but also looks specifically at the archival legacies and documents of us here at the university. So we want to, through both of these kinds of projects, to recommit ourselves to inclusive curricula and projects. And now I will hand it to Victoria to take on our production.
Right. Thank you all for being here with us today. And it looks like we're pushing up towards 100 online, which is wonderful. Welcome everybody, and welcome Ben. So lovely to have you here. I was going to try to wing it, but I think I will just read it. Ben is
with the winging too.
Well, I was like, I know this bio. I know
exactly.
But I will do it in any case. So Ben is an assistant professor in the information school at the University of Washington, where he started the Lab for Computing Cultural Heritage. Ben's research explores how to reimagine search and discovery for large-scale digital collections held by libraries, archives, and museums. And I'm sure we'll get a great overview of this today. Previously, Ben served as an innovator in residence, as well as a Kluge Fellow in Digital Studies at the Library of Congress. He's also the inaugural Digital Humanities Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and received his PhD in Computer Science and Engineering from the University of Washington, which was supported by an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship in Machine Learning. I think we're just very lucky that Ben decided to fall in love with cultural heritage. And over to you, Ben.
Oh, thank you. It's extremely generous of you, Victoria. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm such an admirer of the work of Cafe and all of you here at University of Maryland. So it's a real treat to get to talk with you all. Can everybody on Zoom hear me okay? Good. I think I found the camera right back there, so I can try to make eye contact. Kudos to the hybrid environment. I know it's challenging, but this is great. So thank you all for being here. My name's Ben. I'm excited to be talking. I'll talk for like the next 35, 40 minutes, if that sounds good. Perfect. I should mention I'm a Marylander by birth, so it's really nice to have a homecoming of sorts and be back. And also I managed to make it through with my trusty Bloodstones in with the snow and ice. But wonderful to be here. So as Victoria mentioned, my work broadly construed asks these questions around sort of how we reimagine digital collections from this perspective of search and discovery. And we're in a really fun time when it comes to digital collections. On the one hand, we have these incredible digitization efforts, like at the Library of Congress Serials Division, where we now have these stacks of newspaper pages in the Madison Building and across the country that are being converted into these incredible digital artifacts, such as the one in Chronicling America, which now has eclipsed 20 million pages, well over 100 terabytes of data and metadata. And if we turn to the World Wide Web, we find an even larger scale, billions of web page snapshots, petabytes of data. And this all raises the central question, which is how do we begin to search these collections? In some sense, we've really begun to unlock these collections through discoverability, but there's also much more work to be done, all sorts of ways we can explore them in new, expressive, interactive ways, and also think about that thorny question of scale that I think we all encounter at one point or another. So that really is the grounding for my work. And I really like using this term computing cultural heritage to try to describe the work that I do. There's so many terms for this kind of work, digital humanities being one of them. I like computing cultural heritage because I think it speaks to the ways in which this work is directly involved in the context of libraries, archives, and museums, and interfacing directly at the collection level. So my work, instead of necessarily asking just downstream questions in a humanistic context, I'm really interested about the context by which we make these collections discoverable and searchable. So with this kind of work, I build these large-scale search and discovery systems using AI and other kinds of methodologies. I explore how a wide range of patrons, from scholars to members of the public, can interact with these systems. And also thinking about how we teach students about opportunities and challenges when it comes to AI and cultural heritage, from undergraduates to the MLIS curriculum as well. So my academic home, as Victoria mentioned, is the University of Washington, where I'm very fortunate to be in the information school. My PhD is at UW, as we call it colloquially, as well, over in computer science. And so in one sense, my disciplinary training and background is with one foot in questions coming from AI, sort of frontier AI research, to use the term that's in vogue these days with all sorts of loaded connotations associated with it. But that, I think, informs some perspective on the methodologies that I'm interested in. but also have a grounding within libraries, archives, and museums. And so I've been really fortunate to spend some time at the Library of Congress in a couple of different contexts now, at the Innovator in Residence and over at the Kluge Center on a fellowship a couple years ago. And I've also spent time at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I'll actually speak about in a moment. But in some sense, I think this captures how I think about myself and the ways in which I'm able to think about these ideas in computer science, but see libraries and archives as the context in which I'm conversant in. And I like to think that I get to sort of parachute in and learn from everyone who's really embedded in these spaces and learn. So it's a really privileged position that I'm able to be in and going back and forth. And I think that really informs the kind of work that I'm interested in. So just to try to give a concrete sense of what this work looks like, my start in this research actually comes from my own familial context. So my grandmother survived Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and the family archive has been one that's been the draw for me and has been my own orientation toward this context of being immersed within archives. So soon after, or I'd say while I was a teenager, my grandmother and I visited the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, and we heard about this archive called the International Tracing Service Archive, now known as the Arlson Archive. And it's this incredible collection of, now of hundreds of millions of pages of documentations of survivors and victims of the Holocaust, meant to me immediately post-war as this sort of tracing service to allow victims, individuals, loved ones find each other, facilitated through phonetic name matching. And here we are, 75 plus years later, asking about how we make this archive searchable, recognizing that one of the central challenges here is that this was never set up to be an archive in the standard sense. It has no real finding aid. Instead, it has all these index cards that move from a phonetic name to underlying documents. And so I found myself returning to the Holocaust Museum, a decade after my grandmother and I had been there, to be on the other side, asking maybe computationally what it looks like to try to reimagine how we understand these cards, recognizing that the Survivors and Victims Resource Center staff, the ones who are processing these requests on a regular basis, are going from these kinds of index cards to the underlying collection, and understanding that the kinds of visual information on the cards actually tells us a lot about the underlying document types. And so shadowing them and watching them process requests on my grandmother and my own family has been was the sort of context by which I became really interested in this work. And so the cards on the right here are actually cards of my grandmother herself. And so I try to think about my work as being driven, on the one hand, these computational questions. On this other hand, from understanding what it's like to be represented within the archive, trying to understand the limits of these kinds of approaches, the ethics of datafication and such. And so I just offer that because I think that's the underlying sort of motivation behind a lot of the work that I'm interested in. Talking a little bit about what this looks like in practice, I've been really fortunate to work with the Holocaust Museum and colleagues at UCLA, Robert Ehrenreich, Todd Pressner in particular, on extending this work. And so we have a white paper coming out in a little bit, hopefully later this month, around thinking about some of these questions around datafication and these efforts to improve discoverability in the context of Holocaust memory, contending with some of these other challenges with representation, with large language models and such. And so I'm happy to be sharing this in the coming weeks. I've done some work around sort of digitized maps at the Library of Congress, which has been really fun with student Jamie Wald around searching these maps in sort of visual manners as well, with kinds of natural language queries. Doing work around trying to build out tooling for, say, photojournalists and photo editors who have these incredible archives of materials that they shot over the course of their careers, but not much metadata, understanding these kinds of limitations and how we build out sort of open source tooling to allow them to be able to browse their archives in new ways, working really closely with Kara Pollack and Chris Morris, a photo editor and photojournalist who I deeply admire, and working with Yingshan Huang, who has done this incredible work about building this open source digital collections explorer, where you can take up to hundreds of thousands of photos on a MacBook and with a few lines of code, spin up an interactive browsable interface where you can search these materials textually and visually. And I've also done some work around sort of trying to identify ways of documenting practices around applying AI to cultural heritage as well. But I want to spend my time talking about sort of two projects. The first will be a project called GovScape, thinking about how we, again, invoking that word, how we scale up, and then also thinking about what the sort of state of the field around AI and libraries work looks like, and thinking about opportunities for discoverability and where we all might be able to come together collectively, recognizing that, I think especially at this moment, questions around AI and libraries, of course, has many different dimensions to it and can oftentimes lead us to a question of what agency looks like in this context and where we might go. So to start with GovScape, this project really builds on some of my interest in the work in the Library of Congress and back to the Holocaust Museum. But we're at this point where the Internet Archive has just hit 1 trillion pages archived, which is a number that I really just truly cannot get my head around. And so how we even begin to think about 1 trillion items or 1 trillion things is beyond me. But we know the importance of web archives, just turning to different disciplines, historians, such as Ian Milligan in his book, History in the Age of Abundance, talks about how our historical record is being and will be profoundly affected by these massive born digital repositories. We understand that topics in the 1990s and beyond start to enter the domain of historical research. We're now faced with new questions, new subjects, and even these kinds of new methodologies that allow us to try to grapple with the billions and even trillions of pages that have been archived. I've done some work with Trevor Owens and Jonah Estes around trying to do close readings of these artifacts within web archives, looking in particular at Colin Powell's infamous 2003 PowerPoint to the UN Security Council, PowerPoint as we call it for short, or Powell.pps. And it's really interesting tracing these artifacts through the web archives. And one of the really interesting things that we found in looking at this PowerPoint in particular is that the version that the State Department purports to be the PowerPoint is not the actual PowerPoint. In fact, this is a more PowerPointified version where the embedded slide there in the bottom left is the real slide that Colin Powell used. And so it's interesting to think about the sort of documentness conveyed by the PowerPoint, also understanding these chains of provenance through these kinds of archives. And so it was really thinking about these kinds of artifacts and also the other contexts for which these kinds of web archives are useful that's led me to this project, GovScape. So we, of course, know the pervasiveness of link rot, just pointing to some work around, Supreme Court cases where, 50% of the links are basically unusable, or large fractions, I should say. The same thing being, let's say, internet citations in the New York Times as well. And computer scientists, of course, are using web archives increasingly these days. They're central to AI research. So when we think about these foundation models that are being trained with web archives, whether Common Crawl, the Yahoo Flickr Creative Commons data set, web image text, all sorts of data sets, you name it, we find that if we go into the training data for something like GPT-3, some of these newer models, of course, this is all opaque, but just to say what we do have clear provenance for, we find that web archives and cultural heritage data is ultimately what's powering these systems. So this begs the question of how do we actually make these web archives searchable? In some sense, we know about how to search web archives. Many of us here, I'm sure, have used the Wayback Machine, which is a lot of fun. And so here is cs.washington.edu from, I think, like 1996, if I'm not mistaken. So we've seen how far JavaScript has come. And this is a really valuable way of us tracking change over time, understanding these contexts of web pages as a site evolves. But what I'm really interested in asking is, what does it look like to search longitudinally across web archives? How can we search across pages, identify recurrent content, and do these kinds of longitudinal searches that we're accustomed to when browsing different kinds of documents? And so this work goes back to some collaborations with Trevor Owens, who I just mentioned, now Chief Research Officer at the American Institute of Physics, around looking at government documents, and in particular, more digital government PDFs, recognizing that we can extract the text, but also the metadata and especially the visual content embedded within these PDFs are extremely interesting and seem valuable for searching. And we became interested in asking, how do we expand this kind of work beyond some of the initial explorations we had done? And we gravitated toward the end of term web archive, which is, in my opinion, one of those incredible multi-institutional collaborations that now at the end of every presidential administration, I believe, since 2008, has archived federal.gov.mil sites and tried to create a persistent version of the online presence of the federal government with each presidential administration. And so the end of term web archive makes this available. And so, for example, with 2008, we have about 15 terabytes of data. This is about 4.5 million PDFs. Of course, there are all sorts of file types I should mention. Interested in PDFs to start because we at least know what a PDF is to a certain extent. And they're also annoying to search, as I'm sure many of us have encountered. And so we find all sorts of sites. The Government Publishing Office has a whole ton, USDA.gov, House.gov, Census.gov, CDC.gov, you name it. And there are these PDFs coming from these sites in these crawls. If we fast forward to 2020, we find the scale's increased up to 266 terabytes, over 10 million renderable PDFs, 50 pages or under. And again, we see a pretty high diversity of the domains that these PDFs are coming from. But again, I want to emphasize that these continue to grow. 2024, the crawl is now over a petabyte. It's still being put online. So for what I'll be talking about, this is primarily working with 2020, but we hope to expand this further. Recognizing that in many ways we have a unique opportunity here to begin to understand how the federal government understands itself, but also to make these documents searchable. How do we develop multimodal capabilities? So going beyond just keyword search. How do we serve these at scale? Make them resources for journalists, scholars, members of the public who want to search these Gov docs. And eventually, how can we scale this out over archives like the entire end of term archive? And so this collaboration is thanks to a whole host of collaborators. And I'm very fortunate to co-lead this project with Kyle Dietz, who I recognize, I have to say, I just gave a talk with him. And so I removed his image because we gave the talk together. So Kyle, I'm sorry your face isn't on the slide, but very fortunate to be working with Kyle and so many other collaborators. And especially on a project like this, we're bringing all sorts of different disciplinary contexts to the work. And so just to fast forward a little bit, the idea is, how do we facilitate, say, semantic text search, doing natural language queries that go beyond just literal string matching to be able to query these documents, things like pediatric healthcare in rural areas? How do we search them visually, try to find redacted documents? I think, in my opinion, sort of the classic example of a query that you can't make textually, redaction is the absence of text. So what does it look like to actually identify those features on the actual image level? And lastly, thinking about things like keyword search and filter conditions. And the constraints that we're thinking about here is, of course, low latency. So making sure that we can get a system that's responsive. We all know from HCI that if anything takes longer than a second to load, people will just leave the site behind. And also thinking about the fact that we're not an industry AI lab and we have computing infrastructure that we need to be able to get to work. And so one of the components of this has been really trying to emphasize efficiency where possible. But I'm very happy to share a demo of the site GovScape, which I realize that's perfect. So if you go to govscape.net, you'll now find the site that we're hosting since late November. And as I mentioned, we offer 3 different kinds of search: semantic text search, visual search, and keyword search. And we're serving about 70 million government document pages as of now. And so if we go to visual search, I'll start with my favorite, which was redacted documents. And if we punch it in, we find all of these examples of government PDFs that have been redacted in various ways. And so we can also apply things like filter conditions. Let's say you just want to find redacted documents from the CDC, for example, or isolate crawl dates, which will become more relevant as we expand out searching. But if you click through, you start to see all these incredible examples of redacted documents. This one's from the George W. Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M. I like it because it has somehow the word unsecret at the top of it, which seems rather fun from a redaction perspective. But you can start to click through and browse these PDFs. So here we have all of the thumbnails. We also have the original crawl URL. Of course, that might be down by now, but you can also generate a link to share this with friends or bookmark it for yourself and download the PDF. So we're in the process of adding a whole bunch of new functionality here as well to make these a bit more searchable, which I'll speak about in a moment. But then on semantic text search, we can do things like pediatric healthcare in rural areas. And if we scroll down, if we click through, we find here's, what is this? Evidence roadmap, telehealth and healthcare access for rural populations. And the page that was highlighted, I imagine, has some sort of ongoing research abstracts that have to do with the pediatric context or healthcare for children. And then, of course, we can go and do very basic keyword searches. So for something like COVID-19, and here we're just going to find the top searches with the literal string COVID-19. So we have a whole bunch of directions that we're interested in taking this. And as I mentioned, this is a version that we have up and running. And so we're now at the point where we can finally start to get user feedback, which we're really excited about. So this allows us to start to think about questions like user log data, and I'll speak to some of those things in a moment. But I do want to emphasize what it looks like to try to build a system like this and make it performant from the perspective of how we actually process the PDFs and serve the site. So the process here basically involves building out a pipeline for processing these PDFs, where essentially we ingest the PDFs, we render them, we turn them into individual pages into images, extract the text, generate embeddings for all of those things, and then also index the keywords, index the embeddings and such. And so right now, where it's been very fun, and I have to credit Kyle in particular for doing some incredible work around efficiency in this pipeline. His background's on the database side. So now we're about to serve about 50,000 PDF pages per dollar spent on compute as we've optimized it. So we think we're at the cusp of being able to scale this to about 1 billion pages of Gov docs on a reasonable academic budget here. So our goal now, moving forward, is to essentially try to scale this out, as I mentioned. We have an archive paper that's up, and the code base is also fully accessible. One of our goals here is to facilitate reuse as much as possible. And over the past month and a half or so, we've had a couple thousand queries. It's been really interesting to see what people have tried to search for and what people actually haven't been able to search for. So on the text side, we've had things like policies regarding rainwater collection for the natural language queries. Visually, we've had people searching for geologic maps or data tables. On keyword side, you name it, people have tried. And so in terms of active development, I just want to spell out a couple of things that we're hoping to get toward. So as I mentioned, doing log analysis more broadly after we have more uptake to think about how people are understanding search behavior. Expanding the PDF coverage across all of the crawls, improving efficiency in our pipeline and our serving architecture, especially as we scale up. Thinking about releasing derivative data. We now have OCR for most of these PDFs, thanks to the folks at AI2 who very generously OCR'd some of them with their new home OCR model, which is just higher quality than the embedded text. Thinking about expanding our multimodal capabilities, so developing data sets of image caption pairs, fine-tuning models, CLIP and VLMs on this data, and thinking about automated metadata extraction, which I'm sure to any librarian who works with government documents is raising their eyebrows for understandable reasons. So our goal here is things like first passes at creation date, title, authorship, knowing that these documents are incredibly heterogeneous and doing this is just obviously not possible to do perfectly by any means. But more long-term, our interests here are thinking about user evaluations surrounding our search affordances and figuring out how to improve them. Thinking about these kinds of collaborations with the folks who would be using these collections. So journalists, librarians, social scientists, humanists, incorporating mixed tile types. So expanding out to say web pages, spreadsheets and beyond, and developing the search infrastructure further. But now I want to actually take a turn to that idea that I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk around AI libraries and the public. To sort of shift gears from asking what does it look like to try to scale things up toward what does it look like to try to democratize access to tooling and think about our collective role with this kind of work from the perspective of discoverability, policy, and beyond. So my work in this space, and GovScape in particular, really derives from a project called Newspaper Navigator that I started now, I guess, 6.5 years ago with the Library of Congress through the Innovator in Residence program. It's hard to believe how much time has passed already. But the idea with Newspaper Navigator was to build on that newspaper collection that I mentioned at the start of the talk called Chronicling America. This incredible resource that now has well over 20 million digitized historic newspaper pages that are all in the public domain. And supports API and bulk data access. And I mention this just because that kind of core infrastructure is what makes my work possible. And so being very clear about recognizing how valuable that work is, I think is crucial here. These newspapers have all sorts of end users, just like the GovDocs do. So we have teachers and students in the classroom, genealogists using these collections to search for hometowns or ancestors, scholars in the archive, journalists, and of course, just curious members of the American public who browse these collections on a regular basis. And so we know how to search these newspapers to a large extent. Many of us are familiar with things like OCR, optical character recognition, which identifies the text on the page and allows us to do a query where we not just find where the keyword is appearing, not just that it's appearing on the page, but where it's appearing. And what my interests are asking more broadly, how do we extend that kind of search to say the visual materials on the page? So my work draws really heavily from crowdsourcing work, such as the Beyond Words project at the Library of Congress, which asked volunteers to identify all of this really cool visual content embedded on the page. Those underlying photos, illustrations, maps, comics, cartoons, you name it. And to not only identify them, but then transcribe the caption, note down the artist, some other features as well. And it accrued thousands of annotations during its life cycle. So really an incredible project. And I saw some of the resulting visual content, I'll have a sip of the seltzer. And recognized that, one, it was incredibly interesting to see newspapers in this visual way. I was used to seeing them very much as like textual documents. Excuse me.
And do you want regular water?
Oh, the seltzer is perfect. Orange and vanilla is great. All right, I think I'm good. But yeah, so really interested in this kind of really cool visual kinds of representations we were seeing. All of these charts, all of these editorial cartoons, all these different pages of the newspaper that were animated to me in entirely new ways. And I also saw this perhaps as a source of training data to ask how we might begin to borrow language from the Library of Congress's digital strategy, try to throw open this treasure chest. And the idea behind the project was if we could start with the newspaper pages, identify the visual content and try to serve it as a data set to end users, build out a search application for allowing people to browse it in new ways, and then put it in front of the public. This could be a useful paradigm and really one that you probably sense is being mirrored with the GovScape project as well. And so with the data set, we were able to fine tune an object detection model, one that on the left, things have changed a lot. This was back in 2019, 2020, but a model on the left that's really good at, say, identifying dogs in images from cell phone images or whatnot. That in some sense, there's a very natural resonance between doing that task on the left and identifying an editorial cartoon on a newspaper page on the right. And so it turned out it was actually possible to do this by using the Beyond Words crowdsourced annotations as a source of sort of data for fine tuning. So we now had a model that could be that could take in Chronicling America pages and give back all sorts of predictions about where the visual content is, which we could crop and save out, get captions from the bounding boxes, and just get all the OCR falling within the bounds of each image. And it allowed us to do things like this, to say visualize all of the maps from 1861 to 1865, motivated by a question that some of the teaching with primary sources colleagues of ours at the LC had asked around, say, identifying representative maps of the Civil War, which ordinarily would require sitting there going through tens of thousands of pages and cropping them out. Well, here we can just do a quick faceted query against the data set. And what we find is that most of these are pretty much maps of the Civil War. And we also get a sense that some of the underlying digital humanities questions one might ask. Here's a single map that's been circulated in a whole bunch of different titles. So this gives us a sense sort of akin to the viral text project, the ways in which these newspapers are producing circulation, a social network aspect, and we get to see the circulation of visual content as well. And so it was really fun to release the data set. I want to just mention, moving forward here quickly, that in the interest of time, that one of the questions that emerged was we were serving, say, computational access in the form of being able to query the data set, but we also served data in like prepackaged data form. So you could grab all the maps from a given year or all the photos. But what became really clear to us was that there's real value in providing an actual interface for browsing the materials, which probably comes as no surprise. And so the search application that we built out was very much geared toward allowing people to search via caption. So here's the search for baseball. You get about 5,400 results. Again, this is matching to the optical character recognition text transcription for each image. But then also facilitating ways of browsing via visual similarity. So say allowing people to train these quote unquote AI navigators by steering it in positive or negative directions toward or away from certain kind of content. So on the right, these baseball players are just being found via their visual features. And I mention all of this because one of the aspects of doing a project like this was recognizing, as we were developing what became the Library of Congress's first in-house AI application, that there was an opportunity to really try to communicate all these questions of an AI system that might not be obvious to an end user, not just how the AI system responds to a click, but really this large chain of provenance around an AI system that's changing and really heavily mediating how we interact with the system. So here, for example, are 4 different newspaper pages, Black newspapers in Chronicling America, with the same article about W.E.B. Du Bois, and we see the same reproduction of the same photo being circulated. And so here it is in the Iowa State Bystander, Franklin's paper, The Statesman, and 2 issues of the Broad Axe. And so even before you hit digitization, you can already see the materiality of the page, the ink levels, perhaps microfilm saturation or levels and artifacts of the digitization process itself. But we also see the visual content recognition model, for example, based on the confidence score returned by the model. If we make different cuts on confidence score, it really heavily affects what kind of content we're getting back here. So the most stringent cut of 90 is filtering out a whole ton of content, whereas a looser cut of, say, 50% gives us some false positives. Then if we look to the OCR, for example, this is showing the OCR coming back on all 4 of the images. And not only is the OCR wrong in all cases, it's actually wrong in a different way for each of the images. If we just take the text in each bounding box, we see that this is made even worse. And so I emphasize here that this is a question of recognizing that all of these steps are, of course, distorting discoverability. And on the one hand, we have methods of searching, but they're imperfect. And so surfacing those kinds of imperfections show up visually too. So if we try to cluster the images, for example, based on their visual features using a model at the time, we found that we could, reconstruct 3 of the images, but one of them, the really heavily saturated photo of Du Bois, was essentially lost by the model. And so I mentioned this because one of the goals of this work was trying to surface this in the data archaeology that I wrote, but also this led us on this return to understanding how people were using it, seeing the project show up. And I should mention some statistics before I get there. We had about 3.5 million dataset queries across the lifecycle of the project. We had about 175,000 users of the search application. But it was really interesting and eye-opening for me to see, say, educators using this tool in the classroom, in the social studies context, and even in a computer science context for students to learn about AI and develop literacy, contexts around, say, genealogists using the platform as well. But I mention this because there was this underlying theme of patrons trying to understand how AI worked. So this was CS teachers using the AI navigators in their lesson plans, genealogists taking interest in the imperfections of OCR, patrons searching for a wide range of different photos using those AI navigators. And it seemed like there was an opportunity to try to develop literacy surrounding AI and its responsible use. And so that's led me in this sort of almost accidental turn in my career to thinking about AI literacy and how it relates to libraries. And so while I was at the LC, I was really fortunate with a couple colleagues, Jamie Beers and Eileen Jakeway Manchester, to start a reading group around questions around datafication, applying AI and such. And it was really fun to meet people across the LC and have these discussions and learn from them about sort of these kinds of ways in which it affects how they browse or how they make materials discoverable. And in my teaching at UW here, I'm teaching a search and discovery class for MLIS students, but I'm also now teaching a general education class across campus for undergraduates around developing AI fundamentals and AI literacy. And I've also done some work with DPLA around speaking with library leaders to understand AI in a public library context. But I mention this because this different turn in my work in both research and teaching has meant I've ended up spending a lot of time speaking with librarians at all levels of training, from in the classroom at the MLIS level to library leaders, about understanding these questions of AI in libraries. And so here's where I'm going to zoom out a little bit and just try to articulate, I think, some of the findings from my own work, and also, more importantly, from being a fly on the wall and meeting so many librarians and hearing about so many of these questions around maybe what I just broadly see as opportunities for discoverability, and how we might find a lane forward with work with AI in libraries that feels constructive, and also one in which we can acknowledge all of these concrete harms and be deliberate about them. So before moving on, I want to make it clear that I'm not just trying to be an AI booster here, that I do have a vested interest in being deliberate and articulating the kinds of harms that we're up against with doing this kind of work. I should also mention that clearly my work involves AI, and I'm not suggesting from my own vantage point that I'm interested in the wholesale refusal of AI, but I actually think this kind of exercise has been really valuable for me in trying to articulate what I see as a valid use and responsible use case. So we have all sorts of questions around intellectual property. I think this is one that perhaps all of us have encountered in one way or another, that books, data sets that The Atlantic has made searchable. It's really hard to find fiction that isn't in there. So our cultural heritage is being vacuumed up. All sorts of questions around privacy, what happens with the chats that we're using with LLMs or ChatGPT or whatnot. The environmental impact of doing this work, we can think of the data centers in Memphis. We can turn to this great article by Stephen Witt in New Yorker profiling the inner workings of a data center in an undisclosed location. Understanding hallucinations and slop, reference librarians are getting inundated with requests for books that don't exist. We have this weird sort of inarticulable way that AI sort of drives everything toward the statistical median. This idea that all AI art sort of looks the same, or this idea that these systems are similarly sycophantic in one way or another. We have scraping traffic, breaking open all the systems that we're reliant upon for all of our scholarship and stewardship as well. So the 404 media articles on this, I highly recommend. Thinking about the impacts on education and learning, which I'm sure is one we're all thinking about on various campuses. Questions of labor, job displacement, the decline of open science from an AI perspective, knowing that open publishing, questions around developing open models has really gone by the wayside, is trending in a direction that I think is against what I would like to see. And just broadly seeing this question around library values that we bring in an high school context, feel very different than some of these other values that we've seen encoded within the sort of big tech framing of this. So I mentioned this not to bring us into a place of despair, but to actually try to be deliberate about what we're up against and try to think about points of agency here. And so I've seen through this work with DPLA maybe 3 different areas of focus for doing this kind of work. That involves AI. Collection development, so how we apply AI to improve access to collections, very much sort of akin to my own research, which is of course just one very, very small slice of this very large pie. Patron-facing work around developing programming for AI literacy, developing best practices and sort of organizational policies, and internal staff-facing work, that's where the policies come in, thinking about how to support experimentation and such. I've done some work and actually been working with Catherine Fitzgerald, who just has this wonderful paper looking at AI policies in public libraries, and there's been a lot of really exciting work in academic library contexts as well. But I want to here turn to some examples of really interesting work that I see in this space and maybe models that we can all pull from. Seeing models for corpus creation, for thinking about how we work toward a commons for training these systems. So pointing to public domain corpora, the institutional book project, the public interest corpus as well. Thinking about models for fully open AI development, such as my colleagues at the Allen Institute for AI nearby at UW, where we see the OMO family of models being models that are trained fully open data, all the code's made available, documentation is very clear as well, which has clear benefits to the cultural heritage context. Some of the OMO CR work means that we can now OCR, 1 million pages for about $170 on proper GPU cloud service, which is pretty remarkable. Some other work from Hugging Face around this. And also thinking through, this is just obviously a very, very small slice of what's out there in terms of models for toolkits, frameworks, best practices, and community sharing. So I think we're at an exciting point where we really have these models for collectively coming together, whether AI for Land and Fantastic Futures, resources that many of us have been a part of for a long time, or communities, Code for Lib, CNI, thinking about resources like Programming Historian and AI for Humanists for developing the capacity for doing this kind of work. Hugging Face has been, of course, an essential resource here. And of course, I'll plug for the work that Victoria and I have been doing around a workshop that some of you were very kind to attend and participate in as well, around how we can start to think about questions of human AI interaction and how it relates to cultural heritage and digital humanities. We should be doing another version of this in 2026, so more to follow there. But I also want to emphasize some threads of work that sort of ostensibly seem a little disconnected or maybe removed from this kind of work, and try to really pull it into conversation with this work in AI. One being minimal computing, an idea from digital humanities that I think is really central. This idea from the introduction from the special issue in Digital Humanities Quarterly that I love, which advocates for using only the technologies that are necessary and sufficient for developing the scholarship and the work we want to do. And even putting this in conversation with, say, full-blown categorical AI refusal, work that Violet Fox and others have been leading, that I think are really valuable for us, spelling out maybe why we don't want to be using AI systems or generative AI or what this means. And again, I'm not taking the vantage point that I think we should refuse all of these technologies, but rather I think there's a really, really important component of this kind of dialectical exchange by which we can ask what kinds of systems we really want to be using, why we want to be using them, and what kinds of parts we actually want to refuse. So it's here that I just want to sort of take a turn from the first work with Gus gave and then on to the AI libraries and the public, and just think about what a collective vision of this work might look like around an AI commons for libraries. And I don't mean to presume I'm the only person to have thought of this. In fact, what I'm trying to spell out here, I think, is very much just making clear what the whole community or all of our communities have been working toward, and just using this as a broader sort of call to action. I really love the work of Ed Summers, an alum of the College of Information here at UMD. And Ed has this fantastic post about a talk he gave on AI in libraries, where he says that if you take nothing else from this presentation, like to be that despite what the boomers and doomers would like you to believe, the ascendancy of AI is not inevitable. We have big decisions to make. What we decide to do will have a big impact on how these technologies get deployed. And Ed's exactly right. It's that sense of agency that gives us the sense of articulating what it is we do and how we decide is essential. And so I want to think about how we work together and structure initiatives around AI in this environment in which it feels very difficult to reclaim that sense of agency. And so here I see really 4 key elements. I'll actually expand a little bit more, but privacy and stewardship, skill building, thinking about democratized approaches, and community building as well. And so I think we all understand at some level, in thinking through what we might refuse and what we might move forward with, that these kind of broad questions around requiring libraries to share data and collections feels really difficult. Rather, can we look toward open source AI models that are trained on open data, no data transfer required, no IP being stolen to facilitate this work? Thinking about how we reject this idea of, say, full automation, elimination of roles. I love this notion of flipping human in the loop on its head and asking about AI in the loop. What does it mean to think about preserving human values, to incorporating AI into existing workflows with human oversight? How do we think about moving away from opaque solutions that require researcher staff to dedicate valuable time to learning bespoke interfaces and commands, and instead move toward cultivating technical skill building for library staff and also researchers via tutorials and resources? How do we continue to develop AI literacy for all of us? How do we think about the minimal computing aspects here? Instead of trying to move toward the shiniest model with the latest capabilities, what can we think about in terms of the resources that are designed to work on the infrastructure that we already have? I think based on the number of people on this call and in the room, it's remarkable how much computing power we have at our disposal just on these laptops alone with the GPUs. We can churn through millions of items and produce all sorts of new modes of discoverability with what we have. So how can we really try to emphasize working with what we have, understanding the environmental impact of scaling this up endlessly? And lastly, I think ending on this note of refusal, not just incorporating AI for the sake of doing so, but trying to be intentional about what it means to adopt AI only when there's clear benefit. So, and lastly, of course, the notion of communities of practice, building these practices around AI to support shared approaches and foster collaboration. And I really am sort of increasingly thinking about the kinds of resources that we collectively build. We have AI models collectively that are open source, free to use, and can run on laptops. We have these, the corpus creation, these data sets that are copyright permissive, that are pretty remarkable. We have toolkits that are emerging. We have tutorials and code that are built on public domain and copyright permissive collections to allow us to learn how to use these tools and to apply these materials or to apply these skills in all sorts of ways. And lastly, these kinds of communities of practice. So I want to emphasize, we have models for these. It's a matter of us continuing to push forward and use this as a model for the collective work we want to do. And so I just want to end on this note. I think just thinking about broadly the world of computer science and the world of cultural heritage and the fact that it's felt sort of one-sided to a certain degree, and recognizing that at some level, we now understand from the perspective of core AI research that high-quality data is essential to training performant AI systems, not the sort of endless data smog. We know that like 4chan data is just going to be disastrous, right? And the cultural heritage that we're all stewarding and preserving is of immense value. And I mean that value for our core library reasons, but also of value to those who are training these models. They're discovering what we've known for a long time, or have always known, that these collections are invaluable. And so I really want to just echo what Ed Summers has said. I think it's time for us to hold to our values and try to build toward this alternative model, and that we have decisions to make. So let us make those decisions together, collectively informed. So I appreciate you listening as I've sort of taken this turn toward trying to talk broadly about the work that we're all doing. But I see this as an opportunity for us all to be really engaged in the kind of work that we're excited about and bring us to a place of agency with AI and libraries. I'll end with a shameless plug here that I love collaborating in any way possible. I know I've benefited from collaborating with you in the room already very greatly. So thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and looking forward to talking here as well.
Thank you, Ben. I don't know, are we still doing opening the floor to a student question?
Yes, yeah, our tradition here is to open with a student question. That could be from in the room. I've also put this into the chat that we'll read out any questions that are in the chat out into the room, so we can make sure that they're voiced and we don't have to worry about people unmuting. But if there's a student question in the room, we'll let you all have first dibs. If not, we can go to the chat.
But we can definitely wait quietly for up to 6 minutes.
We do have one in the chat, which I can go ahead with, but we got one in the first. Oh.
Sorry, for the second. Probably hearing my question.
Oh,
Yeah, really nice slides. Thank you so much for lending so much meaning to this problem, giving so much more context. Really liked your presentation.
Thank you.
There is so much data, there is so much work we need to do in order to get get our data processes to a better state in every ML pipeline. And the one thing that I'm looking at with researchers at Adobe is that we also have handwritten documents. So PDF documents is so important for a company like Adobe, right? So we are facing problems in trying to not just OCR but also handwritten documents, because that is something that there's so many billions, I think millions, billions pages. That would you have any perspectives on any problems that we will need to think about in this particular?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. And I also think handwriting recognition is like the perfect thing to think about at this time, because I think Dan Cohen has a great post about handwriting recognition, and don't mean to suggest that we've completely solved this and there's tons of research to be done here, obviously. But I think the kinds of questions that were possible to address via handwriting recognition, say a decade ago versus now, have really drastically changed. And so these systems are looking pretty performant. Again, all sorts of questions around digitization quality, about languages being prioritized. And I don't mean to suggest we've solved every edge case, but I think it's a really exciting time for us being able to pursue this kind of work, especially in a cultural heritage context where, historically, I think the kinds of emphasis for handwriting recognition was, zip codes on envelopes that the USPS was using, which is obviously a very valid operational case. But in cultural heritage, it's just a little bit messier for obvious reason. Archival collections are fragile. We have all sorts of questions around handwriting quality, handwriting diversity. But I would say, I think keeping apprised of the latest models that are coming out is really useful. I actually really struggle with this in my own work. It seems like every week there's a new OCR model that somehow does infinitely better than the previous one. And so that's both, I think, exciting, but also brings its own cognitive load with just how to keep up. But I do think being aware of sort of this inflection point that we're at and how that informs evaluation is really valuable. And I think that brings me to maybe the other point, is that I think we're at a moment where we're seeing qualitatively these tools exploding and also real possibilities for what we do. And so just another point to think about how we evaluate these systems, especially in the kind of grounded context of cultural heritage, I think is essential. So I think that's a place where I'd love to learn from you too, in terms of what you all are doing and how you're thinking about evaluating the results you're getting back and bringing these systems into the workflow.
Absolutely. This is so important. I'm so inspired by your work, because there's so many, there's billions of documents, billions of books in libraries and beyond, which have not been digitized, which have not been scanned. There's so much knowledge that is sitting, waiting to be digitized. So I hope you continue to keep up the good work that's actually.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, I think more broadly, what I would say is that, obviously we live in a time in which the influx of a lot of the AI systems that we're facing for that list of harms is very challenging. But I do also have to think that there's some kernel of optimism, especially around the late 90s, early aughts, about what information access could be, what the internet means, what all the efforts that we've been a part of are. So trying to find ways to tap into that optimism, I think, is really valuable. So I appreciate that framing very much.
I'll go ahead and read out one from the chat. And
Yeah,
this
please.
is from Maria. She's one of our MLIS students. This may be a set of loaded questions, but as access to computational analysis of cultural collections continue to grow, issues of information and cultural sovereignty are increasingly important. Drawing on your research, how might we think about cases in which source communities, i.e. indigenous communities, seek control over how their materials are searched, interpreted, or recombined computationally? Are there existing mechanisms or emerging models that address these concerns?
Yeah, what a great question. I think it's exactly right. I think questions around data sovereignty, sort of a computational lens on all of this, is really essential. And I also think just offers us a broad set of questions that we might think about as we have this moment in time where, just broadly speaking, our collections are being used for reasons that might exist outside of the bounds of what we would hope they would be used for. So specifically on the side of data sovereignty, I would point to a project in particular that was featured as a keynote, I guess, at the Fantastic Futures Conference in 2024. So not this last year, but the year before. And I would say to look up one of the keynotes, which is this incredible project around digitizing Maori news. I believe their news archive recorded radio broadcasts, and basically figuring out infrastructure using GPUs to train language models to do this work locally. So none of the information or the archive is being sent via any APIs. It's all being done locally. So of course, thinking about data sovereignty from that paradigm, I think is really valuable and one that I hope we can all draw from. And yeah, I would say, certainly here, I think I have just as many questions about how we can think of data sovereignty as a way of moving forward, just broadly speaking around this kind of work that we're doing. But I think it's exactly right to be pointing to this question.
I second the notion that this is an amazing talk. Really, really interesting.
Thanks, very kind.
I had a question about like evaluation as well. I think at the end of when you were talking about GovScape, you mentioned that you're trying to do like user evaluations. Yes. I guess I'm curious, like, or if you have experience with this with like Newspaper Navigator, but like, who are the types of users that you're trying to like reach to see how they think about it, and like how do you actually go about like just like is it like surveys or having people like annotate like what works for them and what doesn't? Like I guess
yes,
hear more about that would be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. It's such a great question, and I think ultimately where I'd like to move with this, so this is looking maybe on the horizon of a year plus, but trying to lay the groundwork, I think is for 3 different forms of evaluation. So we'll have the sort of log analysis, which I think is really valuable to get a sense of broad trends of what people are looking for. But of course, we lack that specificity that you mentioned is so important. Like, what are the kinds of searches that people are, what are the experiences? Are they exploratory searches? Do they have an exact end destination in mind when they search, more an information retrieval style? So I think going to the perspective of doing survey work and doing informational interviews to understand what people's search needs are incredibly valuable. And here I point to a lot of the work that I'm excited to learn from around librarianship when it comes to government documents. And then lastly, I think just doing like in-person user evaluation where we bring people in, see how they work with the system and figure out what they're able to search for, what they can't search for, and sort of using those kinds of different modes in concert with one another. Maybe just to say a little bit about Newspaper Navigator, I would say informally based on some of the evaluation we did, one of the really eye-opening things for me about the project, as I may have mentioned, was recognizing that the user base ended up just being so much wider than I had ever envisioned it. I think I was coming from a digital humanities context, and I thought, oh, well, this would be like a perfect tool for a historian. But really, genealogists ended up being one of the primary power users of the tool. And then also in the classroom was this context that I had never really envisioned, but it was so cool hearing from like social studies teachers who were having their students use the tool in the classroom to like explore a slice of history. So all just to say that I think I remain excited by the possibilities of just hearing how people are using it and having that inform, maybe in some even informal or ethereal sense of what it means to do evaluation too. So even just that word of mouth and hearing back from people is really valuable. Yeah.
So overall reputation of AI across the public is pretty much in the toilet. Of course, with corporate overtaking kind of becoming a big buzzword, and of course, Twitter. But how would you advocate for this kind of usage of LLMs in a way that's kind of conducive to kind of getting away from the, oh, it's not that kind of AI?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that we're sort of at this point in time where there is some sort of fundamental conflation of AI with like generative AI coming from companies in very specific contexts. And so one of the things that I always point to, at least in terms of a library context, is to think about the AI affordances that we've already incorporated into library practices and don't necessarily even think of as such. So OCR being a perfect example of a broad set of AI methodologies that every library, archive, museum benefits from. And we understand that the question perhaps less is about refusing OCR as a methodology that we're using and more asking, why does OCR perform better in certain languages or certain contexts? So I think that framing is really helpful. Also, just thinking more broadly, right? All of the infrastructure behind our library discovery systems, these search algorithms are all AI in one way or another. Even thinking about operations, right? Like how we optimize books on the shelves, how we schedule. These are all questions of AI. And so I think maybe if we can point to examples that we've come to understand as essential to practice within cultural heritage, maybe that gives us a path forward to think about what specific versions of, say, the LLMs might be valuable, but not to say we should adopt them wholesale, if that makes sense. Yeah, of course.
Anyone thinking of you? Okay. I'll take another one from the chat then. Let me see. This is from Anna Resnick, and she's asking, what key recommendations do you have for people to get more up to speed with the use of AI with their collections, especially for solo archivists that are wearing many hats but see the potential that AI isn't there out of the box? For additional context, my archive is largely architectural plans and photos of buildings. AI has struggled with figuring out what is more visual and what is text, and applying OCR or provides way too much information or is not detailed enough for my situation.
Yes. So in terms of resources, it's a really good one. And so what I would say is, I believe this is being recorded, so hopefully the slide deck, you can go back. But I would say not at the risk of referring back to my slides, which I hate to do, but just to say that some of the resources I mentioned, especially around sort of communities of practice, I would point to purely because like AI for Lamb and a couple of those other organizations have like lists that are compiled specifically of tutorials for how to use some of these systems, how to think about applying them in a very practically oriented manner, which I think is really valuable and what we need. It's like evaluations of tools. It's for people who are interested in learning some of the coding here back here, like how do you actually use this model to do X or Y or Z? And so I would definitely point to those, and it's really, really great that at this moment of time we have communities that are sharing in such an intentional way about this.
Great, it is 5 o'clock. So unless we have any final words in the room.
It's always 5 o'clock somewhere.
I know. And now it's 5 o'clock here. Well, everyone, with that in mind, let's all thank Ben for being here and talking with us today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.